From bartering goats to financing condos, it's quite a journey.
It really is.
We're going to be taking a deep dive into the history of globalization.
We're going to find out how those connections built the world we live in. And what's really interesting is that globalization, it's not new.
Right.
Yeah, it goes back thousands of years.
Wow.
Full of crazy twists and turns, booms and busts.
I like it.
Yeah, and we'll be looking for those moments where you're like, aha, that's how it happened.
I love those aha moments.
We'll be showing how trade, innovation, and unfortunately, sometimes exploitation have always kind of been woven together.
Yeah. So let's go back to the very beginning.
Okay.
Way before Amazon Prime and overnight shipping.
Way before.
Before those pyramids were even built.
Yeah. Imagine a time when just having agriculture, that was like the hottest new tech startup. Okay.
We're talking about the Neolithic Revolution.
Okay.
Around 10,000 BC, our ancestors in the Fertile Crescent, they're figuring out how to farm.
Right.
They ended up with more grain than they knew what to do with.
So what'd they do?
Well, they probably looked around and they're like, what can we get for all this extra stuff?
Right. I have extra grain, you have extra cows.
Exactly. And it wasn't just for necessities either. We found lapis lazuli.
What's that?
Oh, it's this beautiful blue stone, crazy valuable.
Okay.
Traded all the way from Afghanistan to Mesopotamia, silk, all the way from China, crossing continents. These ancient trade routes weren't just about stuff, they were about connecting people and ideas across huge distances.
So basically that desire for something a little, I don't know, luxurious, a little fancier, that's what got these really intricate trade routes going. It's a tale as old as time. But let's be real. Not everyone was living the high life back then.
Definitely not.
Even in these ancient empires, we see this pattern of wealth. It always seems to end up in the hands of just a few.
Right.
Take the Palace of Knossos, for example,
Okay.
on the island of Crete. It was this opulent palace.
Fancy.
Oh, yeah. A testament to just how much wealth and power a select few can control. It makes you think about the people who actually built those incredible structures, doesn't it?
It really does. Okay, so we've planted those seeds of globalization, but what about the Dark Ages? Were they really that dark for the global economy?
That's where it gets interesting. While Europe was in a bit of a decentralized phase after the fall of Rome, it wasn't a complete economic standstill.
Okay.
Feudalism, although limiting, it actually encouraged local trade networks.
So kind of like the whole farm-to-table trend we're seeing now.
Exactly. It's amazing how history repeats itself, right? But here's the thing. While Europe was focused on those local economies, a different kind of globalization was booming somewhere else.
Where?
The Islamic Golden Age. From the 8th to the 14th centuries, powerful caliphates emerged. And they weren't just religious centers. They were hubs of learning, innovation, and you guessed it, global trade.
I should have guessed that.
Right. They revitalized those old Roman trade routes, made them safer, more efficient. Plus, they were pioneers. They came up with things like checks, which totally changed business.
Wow, I had no idea. Okay, so while Europe was figuring things out, the Islamic world was keeping those global connections going strong.
Exactly. And then, of course, there were the Crusades. Now, they were primarily religious, but there was a side effect.
What was that?
Europeans got a taste for Eastern goods. Again, spices, silks, porcelain.
They brought back more than just stories then. They brought back a desire for these exotic goods.
Exactly. But those trips were tough. Long, dangerous journeys by land.
That was the only option back then, right?
Well, not entirely. The Mongols in the 13th century, they changed things, though maybe not how you'd expect.
Okay, how so?
Everyone thinks of Genghis Khan and his warriors as, conquerors.
Right, fierce.
But their empire was massive, stretching from East Asia to Eastern Europe. And that unintentionally created something called the Pax Mongolica.
Pax Mongolica. What's that?
It basically means Mongol peace. Think about it. A pretty stable empire connected by the Silk Road, which they revitalized. This meant safe passage for merchants and goods on a scale that hadn't been seen in centuries.
Wow. So the Mongols, known for their military strength, actually ended up accidentally boosting global trade.
It's true. Sometimes the biggest changes happen by accident, right?
See.
And speaking of big changes, this era also saw the legendary Marco Polo.
Ah, yes. Marco Polo. Didn't he inspire a certain pool game we've all played?
That's the one.
But he was more than just a game, right?
Oh, much more. He was a merchant from Venice, and his travels to China and back, let me tell you, they captured the imaginations of Europeans for generations.
They must have been amazing stories.
They were vivid descriptions of the East, filled with spices, silk, unimaginable wealth. It made everyone want a direct sea route to Asia.
Which is going to lead to some pretty big consequences.
Oh, yeah.
But we've gone from farming being revolutionary to a global trade network spanning continents. It shows that being interconnected globally, it's not a new thing at all.
Not at all.
It's fascinating.
Absolutely.
Welcome back to our deep dive into globalization. Last time, we left off with Marco Polo, stories of the East, and Europe wanting in on those trade routes.
And it wasn't just about the goods, was it? There was this sense of possibility, this whole world out there. Europeans wanted to break free from those land routes controlled by other empires. And that's how we get the age of exploration.
Exactly. So who was brave enough to sail first?
Oh,
right, Portugal. Those explorers were like, we're sailing around Africa to get those spices. See you later.
they were driven by ambition, for sure,
Right.
and that desire for profit. So they hugged that African coastline, set up trading posts along the way.
Right.
It was. And Prince Henry the Navigator, he was a visionary. He really pushed for those seafaring advancements. And they started out looking for gold, but they realized the real prize was spices, peppercorn, cinnamon, cloves. Those little things were worth a fortune back home.
I mean, I get it. Who doesn't want tastier food? It's amazing how wanting something as simple as that changed the world.
Isn't it? We're curious, we want new things, and sometimes those desires have huge consequences, good and bad, like with Christopher Columbus, for instance.
Oh, right, Columbus. He sailed west, thinking he was going to find a shortcut to Asia, but instead,
He discovered the Americas.
oops.
Right. Can you imagine that? Landing on these completely unknown lands? Talk about a game changer. And that's how we get the Columbian Exchange.
The Columbian Exchange.
Hey.
Sounds very official.
Well, it's this huge flow of plants, animals, cultures, and unfortunately diseases back and forth between the old world and the new world.
Okay, so tomatoes in Italy, potatoes in Ireland, even chili peppers in Asia, all because of this Columbian Exchange.
That's right. All these things we see every day have these wild, intertwined histories. But we have to remember, the exchange wasn't always fair. While Europe was benefiting, indigenous populations were being wiped out by diseases like smallpox. They had no immunity.
It's a good reminder that globalization can have a dark side, even when it starts with something like wanting tastier food. And that's when we see mercantilism coming into play, shaping how colonialism happened.
Mercantilism is all about control. Imagine you're a king, right? And your wealth, it's all about how much gold and silver you've got. But there's a limited amount of gold and silver in the world.
So what do? You can't just make more, right?
You find colonies. Those colonies become your treasure chests, full of raw materials, sugar, tobacco, cotton. It all gets shipped back to the home country, and then they sell it right back to the colonies at a higher price.
Talk about a rigged system. It was all about the mother country winning no matter what.
Pretty much. And to make sure it stayed that way, they had policies like the Navigation Acts in England. Colonies could only trade with England on English ships using English money.
Controlling how those goods and resources moved around, that was key to staying in charge.
And where there are rules, there's always someone trying to bend them.
Who managed to do that? Was it the Dutch East India Company?
Bingo. They weren't like the Spanish, focused on conquering. The Dutch East India Company was all about business, especially the spice trade. They had trading posts everywhere, Indonesia, Japan, and they even went head-to-head with Portugal for those spice islands.
They were the original disruptors, huh? Coming up with new ways of doing business, like those joint stock companies, and issuing bonds to fund their ventures. They made a fortune.
But it wasn't always pretty. They were ruthless, exploiting people and resources, and that's a big reason why we still see so much inequality today.
A good reminder that making money, while it can be a good thing, can also have its downsides. But now we've got a new force on the rise, one that's going to take globalization to a whole new level.
The Industrial Revolution. Think technology, advancements like you wouldn't believe. But also, those inequalities we talked about, they're about to get more intense.
This is getting good. We'll be right back to talk about it after the break. Don't go anywhere. We're back, ready to talk about the Industrial Revolution. What a game changer.
It really was. Think smokestacks, machinery, steam engines, iron, the whole world changing.
It's like everything went from being made by hand to mass production, just like that.
Practically overnight.
What were some of the big inventions that made that happen?
So many. Like the steam engine, for one.
Yeah.
Transportation and manufacturing were never the same.
Right. And then there were factories.
Exactly. Huge factories everywhere. People moved from the countryside to the cities for those factory jobs.
It must have felt like the pace of life was speeding up like crazy. Goods were being produced faster, cheaper, and then shipped all over the world.
It was a crazy time, and it changed people's lives in so many ways, good and bad.
Oh, yeah. How so?
Well, on the one hand, it created incredible wealth.
Think of those big industrialists like Carnegie, Rockefeller.
Exactly. But on the other hand, you had tons of people working in those factories I mentioned. And a lot of them dealt with terrible working conditions and low pay.
So while some people were getting rich,
Others were really struggling, and that's why you see labor movements start to emerge, demanding better conditions and fairer pay.
makes sense. It's something we're still dealing with today
For sure. And during all this, imperialism goes into overdrive.
because of the Industrial Revolution.
Absolutely. European countries needed more and more raw materials for their factories and new markets to sell all those goods they were making.
I see. So what did they do?
They looked to Africa.
Ah, the scramble for Africa.
Exactly. European nations basically divided the continent amongst themselves, often with no regard for the people who already lived there.
Another dark side of the quest for economic power. And then, of course, you have the two world wars.
Talk about a turning point in history. All those political and economic tensions boiling over.
And the world was never the same. We see the rise of the United States and the Soviet Union.
The Cold War.
Even though it wasn't a traditional war, it still had a global impact, right?
Oh, absolutely. Proxy wars, the threat of nuclear war. It was a tense time. And it actually led to another wave of globalization as both sides tried to expand their influence and promote their own economic systems.
Fascinating. It just goes to show that even when it's about ideas, it's still connected to economics. And then, just when it seemed like the world was settling into this new reality after World War II, there's another big shift.
The digital revolution.
Right. We went from those huge computers that took up entire rooms to the internet, smartphones, and now we're all connected like never before.
It's mind-blowing, really. We share information instantly, goods, culture, everything's global. The world seems smaller.
But it's not without its own set of challenges.
Yeah.
Right, like misinformation, cybersecurity threats.
Exactly. It's a double-edged sword, for sure.
That's a good way to put it. So here we are, we've gone from those early farmers bartering to this digital age where everything moves at lightning speed.
It's been quite the journey.
It really has. And we've seen how human innovation and ambition have shaped it all. But also some of the darker sides of globalization.
That's the thing about history. It's full of contradictions.
It's true. And as we face all these new challenges like climate change and economic inequality, it's more important than ever to learn from the past.
So we can create a better future for everyone.
Well said. This has been a fascinating deep dive into the history of globalization. Thank you for joining us on this journey. We'll see you next time for another deep dive.